This election cycle in my hometown of Munich, the Christian Social Union, a Bavarian political party, put a poster saying Gute Architektur fördern, or promote good architecture, subtitled Let us build mindfully again. Unfortunately, I could not check easily what exactly they meant by this because the URL on the poster ironically directs to an unbuilt web page. But the CSU is certainly not alone in their sentiments that architecture these days is getting worse. It's easy to find a plethora of articles claiming that architecture is getting worse. The same is probably true for music. Many people seem to believe that modern music is somehow getting more boring, simple, and less creative than it used to be. In this video essay, I will unfortunately not be able to answer that question. However, I will try to show that the underlying logic is probably fundamentally flawed. Let's dive in. Why did I say that the underlying logic is flawed in the belief that architecture is getting worse? It has to do with selection bias. The old buildings that remain around us are buildings that people took the care to preserve over decades, or in some cases even centuries. New buildings, on the other hand, have not yet had to withstand that test. In other words, the old buildings that remain are not necessarily representative of the buildings that were built back then. Rather, they are the buildings that one might call time-tested. This is an example of selection bias. Selection bias occurs when the data we collect is not representative of the underlying population we're analyzing. In the case of architecture, the old buildings that have remained are not representative of all the buildings that were built back then. We are applying a selection to that sample. In the case of music, the same is true. Data from top music charts show that songs stay in the charts for a few weeks. So a conservative number for the total number of new songs you hear by listening to the radio is a few hundred per year. That means that during the whole, say, 80s decade, you'd conservatively hear several thousand different songs on the radio. But Spotify's playlist of music from the 80s only lists 105 songs, a few percent of what people have heard through the 80s. Those songs that stuck around are probably the ones that are exceptionally good at being persistent, being easy to remember and catchy. To be absolutely clear, the fact that most of the music we hear around us nowadays is bad, whatever that would mean, does not mean that wasn't always the case. Since there's a strong selection bias to filter out broadly appreciated music over everything else. There's not just one type of selection bias, there are many. The type we've been talking about so far with music and architecture is survivorship bias. But there are many more types. For example, reporting bias is a selection bias that occurs when there's a bias in which events are reported, some more often than others. There are many more examples though, and I thought it would be helpful to give an idea of in how many cases it can arise by highlighting a few of them. For example, when we try to get a picture of a certain culture by people that migrated away from that country, we actually sample the people that either wanted or were able to move away from that country to a stronger degree than the people that stayed. A nice example of this is the Cuban migrants in the United States. They're actually famous for being anti-Cuban. In history, the opinions and beliefs and life of lower class people are really underreported. Those people were often not producing written texts, and therefore we have a heavily biased perspective of what people cared about because of those underrepresented groups. The media is not an unbiased sampler that feeds randomly sampled facts to us viewers. Rather, it filters, selects, and curates information based on expected interest and potentiality to generate revenue.
I think I was always a journalist, and I think the spirit of a journalist is really the spirit of a truth teller.
Thus, the information we get about the world is that information which the news agency believes will deliver it the most profit. By consuming media, we're observing a world through a information consumability selection bias lens. A fourth example is the so-called anthropic principle, related to how hospitable to life the universe is. We can only ever collect empirical data from universes or environments that, by definition, can sustain life. It is quite possible that there have been other universes before ours that we simply never had the opportunity to observe. This is such a big philosophical topic that I will not do it justice here, so I'd suggest to look up a specific essay on that or to check out Nick Bostrom's book about the topic. There is one final example that is so interesting and impactful that I would like to cover it in a separate video, but I will just mention it now. Whether our history with nuclear weapons suggests nuclear war is an existential threat. Let's circle back to our original question. Are music or architecture getting worse? I tried to show that the very strong selection bias makes it impossible to say this by just looking at old and new buildings at one time point. Questions that involve selection bias certainly do have meaningful answers, but the distorting effects of the bias makes it necessary to collect other types of data. In short, selection bias makes it harder to draw conclusions and easier to give incorrect answers. If you only came to learn about selection bias, you can safely stop the video at this point. If you do, I would love to hear your comments and ideas for future videos on concepts in critical thinking. If you're interested, though, to understand why selection bias can have such a strong effect, stick around for one more minute. You might say, sure, I buy this idea that our data collection isn't perfect and all, but how could it be that all the old buildings I see are pretty and nearly all new buildings I see are not? Well, forgetting all the subtleties and tastes and all, I programmed a little simulation to illustrate how strong of an effect a small difference in building preservation can have. I show here buildings, some of which are considered ugly. So every 25 years, let's say, a committee decides whether to demolish them by a coin toss. For the attractive buildings, however, the question of demolition is only raised every 50 years, so twice as slowly. At the beginning, the number of attractive and unattractive buildings is the same, but notice how the two groups quickly become strongly disbalanced by much more than a factor of 2, the difference in how often they're demolished. This shows that a difference in survivability can actually grow to much larger differences in what we actually observe in the long run. Well, that was it. Thanks for watching my very first YouTube video. I hope you enjoyed it. My current aim is to make short, like 5 or 10 minute videos about key critical thinking concepts such as biases, logic, propaganda, and many more. I actually have too many ideas to put into production. So feel free to give me comments, feedback, and ideas for future episodes. And I hope to see you in the next one.